Welcome to the Hoja on Architecture podcast. Concept in Design. Chapter 5, Narrative Framework. Design education often treats the concept as if it were a single bright idea, a theme, or a poetic phrase meant to inspire the project, but the more one works with architecture and interior design, the clearer it becomes that a concept must do far more than announce itself. A concept cannot live as a slogan or a mood board. It must act as a system that holds the project together. In this episode, we redefine the concept not as a decorative layer or a rhetorical flourish, but as a narrative framework. This structural intelligence unites form, function, and feeling into one cohesive architectural logic. Suppose the previous episodes explored meaning and experience separately. In that case, this episode brings them together by showing that concept is not an isolated intention, but the overarching framework that organizes the entire design process. The term narrative framework may at first sound literary, but here narrative is not about storytelling in the romantic sense. It is about coherence, direction, and structure. A narrative framework is what ensures that a project does not become a collage of unrelated decisions. It acts as the conceptual spine that supports every move the designer makes. The project's meaning, sequence, experience, form, material palette, light behavior, circulation rhythm, functional resolution, and emotional tone all find alignment under this framework. Without it, the project becomes an accumulation of interesting but disconnected gestures. With it, these gestures align and speak together. The narrative framework is therefore not an extra step, but the invisible architecture behind the visible one. One of the key aims of this episode is to articulate why design requires such a framework. Architecture and interior design are fields defined by a high density of decisions. A single project may contain hundreds, even thousands of choices regarding proportions, alignments, materials, junctions, lighting conditions, structural negotiations, and spatial rhythms. Designers who begin without a framework quickly experience decision fatigue, and their projects drift toward aesthetic eclecticism or functional confusion. A concept as a narrative framework provides the stability necessary to navigate this sea of micro-decisions. It creates a consistent environment in which each choice can be evaluated according to whether it serves or contradicts the overarching idea. In this sense, the concept is less an inspiration and more a filtering system. To understand the power of the narrative framework, we must examine how it unites form, function, and feeling, the triad that defines spatial quality. Form expresses the project physically: geometry, massing, proportion, and tectonics. Function describes the project operationally: circulation, performance, ergonomics, use patterns, and programmatic logic. Feeling expresses the project experientially: atmosphere, sensory character, emotional tone, and memory. These three dimensions often compete in design education. Students emphasize one at the expense of the others, but good design binds them together. A narrative framework is the mechanism by which this binding occurs. It asks the designer to articulate not only what their project means, but how that meaning should guide the geometry, how that geometry should organize the behavior of users, and how that behavior should shape the atmosphere and sensory impression of the space. Through this, the concept ceases to be a single idea and becomes an organizing worldview. Establishing a narrative framework requires a method. It begins with defining the core intention, the distilled essence of what the project is trying to express or achieve. This core intention is not a theme, but a direction, a conceptual vector rather than a static noun. From this intention emerge spatial principles, the rules that determine how the project behaves. These principles might concern the treatment of light, sharp or diffused, directional or ambient, the behavior of materials, rough or smooth, warm or cool, reflective or absorptive, the rhythm of space, expansive or compressed, linear or branching, or the relational patterns between volumes, connected, separated, nested, layered. Finally, these principles must be translated into form, circulation, experience, and detail. The narrative framework materializes through this translation. It is here that meaning becomes form and intention becomes inhabitable experience. The absence of a narrative framework is easy to recognize. Students may produce projects with elegant forms that bear no relationship to the stated concept, or atmospheric renderings that feel disconnected from the plan's functional demands. They may combine materials that communicate unrelated moods, attach spatial features because they look interesting, or shape volumes according to precedent rather than principle. These projects require long verbal explanations because the design does not communicate its logic on its own. When a concept is merely a theme, the designer must constantly make up for it with language. But when the concept operates as a narrative framework, the architecture itself becomes the explanation. The project feels inevitable. Every choice appears derived rather than chosen. Coherence is therefore the primary indicator of a successful concept. Coherence does not mean repetition or uniformity. Instead, it means that every element behaves as part of the same family of intentions. In a coherent project, the form supports the function supports the experience, and the experience supports the meaning. The user senses that nothing is arbitrary. They may not be able to verbalize why the project feels unified, but they think it does. This intuitive clarity emerges from the strength of the framework. When the narrative framework is well established, the user perceives the project as a whole, rather than a sequence of isolated design moments. The design becomes a continuous argument. The narrative framework also plays a crucial role in stabilizing the design process over time. Many projects evolve across months or years, during which early intentions can easily be forgotten or diluted. Without a framework, designers risk drifting, adjusting forms without conceptual justification or adding decorative touches that weaken the project's integrity. The framework acts as a compass, a reference that prevents conceptual erosion. It allows the designer to return repeatedly to the organizing principle and ask whether new decisions deepen the concept or contradict it. A project with a stable framework becomes more refined the longer it develops. A project without one becomes more chaotic the longer it continues. By the time the narrative framework is fully articulated, it sets off a chain reaction throughout the entire design. The framework shapes the form shapes the experience, and the experience shapes the user's memory. Memory, in turn, becomes the lasting legacy of the concept. If the memory is strong, the concept has succeeded. If the memory is weak, the concept did not fully materialize. Through this lens, concept is not what the designer says, but what the user remembers. This is the ultimate test of narrative framework. Can the project be felt after it is left behind? If the answer is yes, the framework has done its work. In closing, this episode reframes the concept as the intellectual and experiential backbone of the design process, a narrative framework that unifies form, function, and feeling. Concept is no longer a decorative idea, but a structural mindset. It is the architect's internal architecture, organizing the project with clarity, consistency, and coherence. A strong narrative framework allows meaning to evolve into method, method into form, and form into memory. It is not what precedes design, it is what holds design together. Next time, we shift from organizing the concept to generating it, exploring how reflexive thematic analysis can serve as a rigorous yet creative method for laying the conceptual foundations of design. This concludes the Concept in Design, Chapter 5, Narrative Framework. Thanks for listening. See you in the next episode.